Finally, our last term we're going to look at regarding stream landforms are barrier islands. And barrier islands are a lot of our vacation destinations. And so characteristics of barrier islands is they're separate from but parallel to a landmass. And it's due to sediment supply from rivers and also low tide, so the combining forces. And so you got one force coming towards the barrier islands, coming downslope, that sediment supply from the rivers being counteracted by ocean influences coming back the other way. And so if we think about waves, well, what direction are the waves coming from? They're coming onshore. That combined with high and low tide creates these thin chain of islands that are parallel but separate from a landmass. And they're always on a trailing edge of a moving plate. And so they're always, so we think about the United States. Well, where in the United States do we have the trailing edge of a moving plate? On the Pacific side? No. Pacific side, we've got a lot of collision with plates, convergence and transform faults. So essentially barrier islands, if they existed on the Pacific coast, would be obliterated from convergent forces, from those essentially from two plates crushing into each other. Whereas in the Atlantic side, we don't have that. So the Atlantic side of North America is what we would typically think of the trailing edge of that moving plate. And so the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, we've got the weathered and eroded away sediment that once was the Appalachian Mountains, which in many respects is the sediment that has created the barrier islands. And so if we can kind of wrap our minds around this. So the Appalachian Mountains, we've showcased beforehand, have been, they're one of the oldest mountains in the world, and so over time they've been worn down, weathered away, essentially more hills. I know they're not hills to us, but essentially hills compared to the sharp, angular, rocky features. Well, where did all that sediment go? That sediment just doesn't disappear and go off into outer space. And so what happens is that sediment is then weathered and carried away, eroded away, transported and deposited, and then when it's deposited, once again it's deposited at the mouth of that river. And so we see at the mouth of that river the characteristic barrier islands. But like I say, these are places in which there are massive tourist destinations for all kinds of snowbirds, people who go down for a part of the year to vacation or live in the beaches of Carolina, Florida, Texas, wherever. But they're very poor choices for real estate development because of these areas being quite susceptible to sea level change. And so as sea level rises, which could happen from a storm surge from a hurricane, as it did with some of the more recent Hurricane Irene, for example. But these are they're still building these taller buildings, build them again. It's not sustainable, not a good idea. We'll take a look at that in a future lecture on human impact on the environment. And here we have I believe this is the Jersey Shore. And so we can just see fist pumping and glow tans and all that from this outer space image here. But one of the things is these barrier islands, which you can see. So see that island beach SP? That is part of a barrier island chain running from the northern part of this image down to the bottom, close to Mike Knush, Rutgers University's name. So essentially what we've got is these rivers that are flowing from the left-hand side of the image to the intercoastal waterway, to these in-between bays and harbors, essentially is bringing sediment that is then counteracted by the ocean currents coming in, which creates this thin chain of islands that we can see here, these barrier islands. And going back to a previous map quiz, we've got over on the right-hand side, the eastern side of this image here, we've got the Outer Banks. And so the Outer Banks are essentially barrier islands created from transported and weathered away sediment from the Appalachians, which is bringing, via the various rivers, bringing that sediment to the Atlantic. So it's kind of a deal where those places that we love to go to beach, Outer Banks, Myrtle Beach, Daytona, what those largely are is if you drive down there, you go over the intercoastal waterway before you get to those beachy areas. And those beachy areas are essentially barrier islands, in which that sediment from those rivers upstream, from those rivers that are from many begin up in the Appalachian foothills, brings that sediment to the coast where it's eventually deposited, forming these landforms, barrier islands. And I guess a closer image to see these rivers carrying that sediment to the Outer Banks. So down here we've got South Padre, and so South Padre you can't really see, it's not shown, but you see the inn in Brownsville in the bottom. Actually see the inn in Harlingen. The inn in Harlingen is about where South Padre is. And South Padre is part of these chain of islands, these barrier islands. And so essentially the Rio Grande, as it comes from the Rockies, is bringing away weathered and eroded away sediment, and then eventually depositing that weathered and eroded away sediment at its mouth, forming the chain of islands, these barrier islands here in Texas. So Texas, coastal Texas, we can see this barrier island. It goes pretty much all the way along the entire coast, all the way up to Houston, Galveston.